"We had nothing like it," admitted General Heinz Guderian, the father of German tank warfare, in his post-war memoirs. He was speaking of the T-34, the Soviet tank that shocked the Wehrmacht when they first encountered it in 1941. Built in tractor factories by workers who sometimes included teenage girls and elderly men, the T-34 wasn't pretty. It wasn't comfortable, but it was lethal, and it came in numbers that defied imagination. For every one destroyed, it seemed three more appeared. This is the story of how a revolutionary design, born from desperation and ingenuity, became the nightmare that stalked German soldiers across the Eastern Front. The morning fog lifted slowly over the Russian steppe on October 6, 1941, when Unteroffizier Klaus Becker first saw it through his binoculars. A low, angular silhouette moving through the distant tree line. His hands trembled as he lowered the field glasses and turned to his commander. "Herr Lieutenant," he whispered, "T-34s." The color drained from the lieutenant's face. For the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, no two numbers and a letter had ever inspired such dread. This is the story of the machine that changed the course of history, the Soviet T-34 tank, and why German soldiers feared it more than any other weapon they faced in World War II. That initial go-ahead came after a grueling road test and demonstrations that the tank's maximum of 40 form of sloped armor could withstand fire from 45 AT guns. The T-34 wasn't born from a place of strength, but from desperation. It was based on lessons learned by the Soviets in the 1939 Mongolian-Manchurian border, clashes with the Japanese, and earlier in the Spanish Civil War. The thin-armored, gas-fueled light tanks were not up to the task, and Soviet officials quietly called for the development of a completely new tank. Initial Soviet ventures into Finland in late 1939 proved disastrous, with the loss of 80 tanks in the first week alone to finish anti-tank guns. This catastrophe shook the Soviet military establishment to its core. The Red Army's existing tanks were being destroyed like tin cans, and with Nazi Germany growing stronger by the day, time was running out. In the design bureaus of Kharkov, a team led by Mikhail Koshkin was working feverishly on something revolutionary. By March 1940, the Defense Ministry approved the full-scale production of the new tank at the Kharkov plant, with the use of the main gun from the Kurovsky Works facility and the diesel engines from Factory 75 in Kharkov. The initial T-34 76-1940 model weighed in at slightly more than 26 tons and featured the L-11 76.2 gun. The numbers tell a story of frantic preparation. The first production T-34s were completed in September 1940, completely replacing the production of the T-26, the BT series, and the multi-turreted T-28 medium tank at the KHPZ plant. Production of this first T-34 series, the model 1940, totaled only about 400, before production was switched to the model 1941, with the F-34 gun 9RS radio set, also installed on the Su-100, and even thicker armor. But these early tanks were far from perfect. Only company commanders' tanks could be fitted with radios. Originally, the 71 TK3 radio set, due to their expense and short supply. The rest of the tank crews in each company signaled with flags. Imagine the chaos tank crews trying to coordinate complex battlefield maneuvers by waving colored flags at each other through the smoke and fury of combat. Koshkin died of pneumonia, exacerbated by the drive from Kharkiv to Moscow at the end of that month, and the T-34's drivetrain developer, Alexander Morozov, was appointed chief designer. The father of the T-34 never lived to see what his creation would achieve. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht rolled across the Soviet frontier with supreme confidence. The German army had conquered Poland in weeks, France in days. Their panzers seemed invincible, their tactics revolutionary. By the time of the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the Kharkov factory and the Stalingrad tank factory combined had produced some 1226 T-34s, in a fairly even mix of the models 1940 and 1941. Older, outdated light tanks comprised the vast majority of the tanks the Soviets had at the outbreak of war, with only 5% being T-34s. Then came the shock. When it appeared near Smolensk during the mid-days of the Russian campaign, terror best describes the reaction. The first encounters between German forces and the T-34 sent ripples of alarm through the Wehrmacht. Both types were encountered on the second day of the invasion, 23 June 1941. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at him, a T-34, which sound like a drumroll. But he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. This was from a German soldier's account, and it captured the helplessness that would define so many encounters with the T-34. The standard German 37 anti-tank gun, which had performed admirably in Poland and France, was suddenly useless. German soldiers nicknamed it the door knocker because its shells simply bounced off the T-34's sloped armor. In one wartime account, a single T-34 came under heavy fire upon encountering one of the most common German anti-tank guns at that stage of the war. Remarkably enough, one determined 37-gun crew reported firing 23 times against a single T-34 tank, only managing to jam the tank's turret ring. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist called it the finest tank in the world, and Heinz Guderian affirmed the T-34's vast superiority over German tanks. These weren't Soviet propagandists speaking. These were the architects of the German Blitzkrieg, the men who had revolutionized tank warfare, admitting they had been outclassed. At the time, German General von Kleist called the T-34-76 the finest tank in the world. But what made it so formidable? The answer lay in a combination of factors that German tank designers had overlooked or dismissed. First was the armor, not just its thickness, but its angle. At the time, the T-34-76's 76.2 gun was more than a match for any other tank in service at that time, and its thick sloped armor was unhindered by anti-tank weapons at this stage of the Second World War. The sloped design meant that incoming shells had to penetrate effectively thicker armor, and many simply ricocheted off. Then there was the engine. This was a high-powered diesel design that was created at the Kharkov Locomotive Works. It was both reliable and resistant to fire, making the tank better able to survive being hit. German tanks used gasoline engines that would often burst into flames when hit. The T-34's diesel fuel was far less flammable. The wide tracks were another revelation. The T-34 was equipped with characteristics that the German tankers would come to envy. Thicker armor that was sloped to further help deflect enemy fire, a robust V12 diesel engine, a low profile, and wide tracks that made movement across snow and mud comparatively easy. The wide tracks proved particularly crucial in traversing the vast stretches of the motherland with its few, comparatively primitive roads that often became little more than canals of mud in the Rasputitsa or the weeks-long wet periods in the fall and spring. But perhaps most shocking to the Germans was the sheer determination of the Soviet tank crews. The tank crews were undertrained. Often drivers had fewer than 5 hours of driving experience. Gunners had never fired a tank gun before, and some crews had not even seen the T-34 before the war broke out. This lack of crew training was exacerbating by the lingering effects of the Stalinist purges, which had wiped out half of the Armored Division's officer corps. Yet despite this lack of training, Soviet tank crews fought with a desperation and courage that stunned their enemies. They knew they were fighting for their homeland's survival. There would be no surrender, no retreat. To stop is to die, is a paraphrase of tanker Georgy Nikolaevich Krivov's comment. The psychological impact on German soldiers was immediate and lasting. The existence of the T-34 and KV heavy tanks proved a psychological shock to German soldiers who had expected to face an inferior enemy. They had been told the Soviets were subhuman, that their technology was primitive, their soldiers cowardly. Now they faced tanks their weapons couldn't destroy, crewed by men who would rather die than retreat. It is remarkable that Lieutenant Stup's tank made hits on a T-34, once at about 20 meters and 4 times at 50 meters, with Panzergranate 40, caliber 5 cm. And still, the T-34 kept coming. Imagine the terror of a German tank crew, firing round after round at point-blank range, watching their shells spark harmlessly off the enemy's armor. The German High Command scrambled to respond. Heinz Guderian demanded an inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front, suggesting that the quickest solution was to produce a direct copy of the T-34. A special Panzer Commission arrived on the Eastern Front on 20 November 1941 to assess the T-34. But copying the T-34 proved impossible. The weapons department held that Germany would have difficulty copying the T-34 as Guderian had suggested, because of the quantity of steel alloy and diesel engines required. Instead, they would have to design their own answer to the Soviet tank. Meanwhile, Soviet production was accelerating despite the chaos of the German invasion. When the Wehrmacht approached Kharkov and Stalingrad, an extraordinary exodus began. On 13 September 1941, the factory was ordered to evacuate to Nizhny Tagil, east of the Urals. The first of 43 trains left on 17 September, the last on 19 October. Although much of the factory equipment reached the new site, only 10% of the workforce and 20% of the engineers followed the machinery. Despite these terrible circumstances, production at Nizhny Tagil began in December 1941, when 25 T-34s were completed. Workers labored in sub-zero temperatures, often without proper shelter, assembling tanks that would go straight from the factory floor to the battlefield. In 1943, T-34 production had reached an average of 1,300 per month. This was the equivalent of 3 full-strength tank divisions. The numbers were staggering. During 1939 to 45, the Third Reich produced 19,938 tanks. Even with the best of Minister of Armaments and War Production Albert Speer's most streamlined methods, the Soviets still outnumbered them, with 53,552 T-34 tanks alone sent from factories to the battlefields of Eastern Europe. The battle for Moscow in the winter of 1941 showed what the T-34 could do when used properly. Winter played a hand, with a 30 degrees C temperature freezing the German lubricants, while the Russian equipment performed fine, especially the T-34 tanks with their specially designed compressed air starters. German soldiers watched helplessly as their vehicles seized up in the cold, while T-34s maneuvered freely through the snow. Out of the snowstorm, German soldiers were running back, scattering in all directions like a panic-stricken herd of animals. A lone officer stood against this desperate mass. He gesticulated, tried to pull out his pistol, and then simply let it pass. The German response came in the form of new tanks, the Panther and the Tiger. Hence, a new German medium tank was proposed, incorporating 3 features of the T-34. A long, overhanging gun, good off-road mobility from large tracks, and sloped glacis armor to give greater protection with a modest thickness of armor. By 1943, the Wehrmacht believed these new weapons would restore their superiority. The stage was set for the greatest tank battle in history, Kursk. In July 1943, the Germans launched Operation Citadel in the region around Kursk, their last major offensive on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. It was the debut of the German Panther tank, although the numbers employed at the resulting Battle of Kursk were small, and the brunt of the burden was carried by the Panzer III, Stu G III, and Panzer IV. The campaign featured the largest tank battles in history. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, involving some 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, and 4,000 aircraft. But the T-34s were ready. However, the T-34 made up the bulk of the Soviet armor. Without including the deeper reserves organized under the Steppe Front, the Soviets massed about 1,300,000 men, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2792 aircraft to defend the salient. The Germans had expected their new Panthers to sweep the T-34s from the field. Instead, they encountered a nasty surprise. More Panthers were often lost due to mechanical breakdowns than enemy fire in 1943. The Germans discovered that some 90% of the tanks suffered transmission failures after less than 1,500 kilometers of combat, and the Panther D endured continued fuel pump problems. Meanwhile, Soviet tank crews had learned from 2 years of combat. The Soviet gunners had learned that their tank could not only move faster, but its turret could turn 5 times faster than the turret on the heavier, underpowered Panther D, and some 50% faster than the Panther A. This gave the Soviets even more reason to close fast, helping to cancel their opponent's advantage of a larger, more powerful main gun, while taking advantage of the T-34's speed and maneuvering abilities. At Prokhorovka, the climactic engagement of Kursk, T-34s charged straight at the German positions. On July 12, the largest tank battle in human history took place at Prokhorovka, as 1,500 tanks maneuvered to destroy each other at relatively close range in the middle of blinding dust. The situation nullified the advantage new German tanks had in armament and firepower over the Soviet T-34 tank, the staple of the Russian army, which had not undergone significant improvement since the start of the war. The aftermath of Kursk was decisive. It marked the decisive end of the German offensive capability on the Eastern Front and cleared the way for the great Soviet offensives of 1944–45. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the East. From now on, they would only retreat. But the T-34's evolution wasn't over. However, the battles in the summer of 1943 demonstrated that the 76.2 gun of the T-34 was no longer as effective as it was in 1941. Soviet tank crews struggled at longer ranges with the additional frontal armor applied to the later variants of the Panzer III and Panzer IV, and were unable to penetrate the frontal armor of the new German Panther or Tiger I tank at standard combat ranges without tungsten rounds, and had to rely on tactical skill through flanking maneuvers and combined arms. The answer came in the form of the T-34-85. More important, the model 1943 replaced the 76mm gun with what had been the M1939-85 anti-aircraft gun to form the T-34-85. The 85 had a heavier projectile than the 75mm gun on the new German Panther, but the German tank was able to penetrate thicker armor at a longer range, thanks to the use of more propellant and a longer barrel. The T-34-85 began rolling off the assembly lines in January 1944. Those enabled the Soviets to take on the lumbering tank killers that the Germans had fielded. Prior to that, we had to run like rabbits and look for an opportunity to turn and get at the flanks of those huge, slow-moving tanks, admitted tanker Nikolai Yakovlevich Zheleznov. The psychological warfare continued to the very end. German soldiers, who had learned to fear the distinctive diesel growl of T-34 engines, never forgot the sound. Veterans would wake decades later from nightmares, still hearing those engines approaching through the darkness. By the end of 1945, over 57,300 T-34s had been built, 34,780 T-34 tanks in multiple variants with 76.2 guns in 1940–44, and another 22,609 of the revised T-34-85 model in 1944–45. The single largest producer was factory N.183, UTS, building 28,952 T-34s and T-34-85s from 1941 to 1945. The German perspective on the T-34 evolved throughout the war. Initially, it was shock and disbelief. The diary of Alfred Jodl seems to express surprise at the appearance of the T-34 in Riga, noting the surprise at this new and thus unknown wonder armament being unleashed against the German assault divisions. Then came grudging respect. The T-34 was, quite literally, the main weapon of war that blunted the formerly invincible Nazi war strategy. Professor John Erickson, author of The Road to Stalingrad and The Road to Berlin, stated, "For the Russians, the T-34 was certainly a war-winning weapon. It was superb on the battlefield, but it represents so much more. It represents the fact that they won a stupendous victory over fascism. Finally, there was the admission of defeat. German soldiers captured late in the war spoke of the T-34 with a mixture of fear and admiration. They had faced the best tanks their nation could produce, Tigers, Panthers, King Tigers, and still the T-34s kept coming. But the T-34 was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of Soviet determination, of a nation's will to survive. The tank represents the best of the Soviet Union. It is an example of technological achievement, cheap and durable design, and mass production. The production of the T-34 also is a reminder of the Russian ability to persevere in the face of scarcity and adversity. Finally, the fact that the T-34, in combination with the Russian winter, saved the nation at its most dire hour cemented the tank as crucial part of the national memory. The factories that produced the T-34 tell their own story of heroism. The Stalingrad tractor factory was introduced into the T-34 production program in 1940, although the first tanks did not appear until the start of 1941. A massive effort was needed to create a viable tank industry at Stalingrad. The city was surrounded by an unindustrialized hinterland, and so every industry needed for the production of the T-34 had to be concentrated in the city. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored in conditions that would seem impossible today. In the evacuated factories beyond the Urals, they worked outdoors in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. They slept in dugouts and tents. Many had lost family members to the German advance, yet they built tanks. By 1943, there were 43 factories producing just two types of tanks, the T-34 and the heavier KV. This standardization was key. While the Germans produced a bewildering variety of tank models, each requiring different parts and specialized maintenance, the Soviets focused on quantity and reliability. The human cost was staggering. With 44,900 lost or damaged during the war, it also suffered the most tank losses ever. Each destroyed T-34 meant 4 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded. The mathematics of sacrifice are numbing. Nearly 180,000 men lost in T-34s alone. Yet for every T-34 destroyed, it seemed 2 more appeared. German tank ace Otto Carius wrote in his memoirs about the psychological impact. We knocked out T-34 after T-34, but they just kept coming. It was like a horrible dream where you're fighting an enemy that can't be defeated. The T-34's influence extended far beyond World War II. Its development led directly to the T-44, then the T-54 and T-55 series of tanks, which in turn evolved into the later T-62 that formed the armored core of many modern armies. The design principles pioneered by the T-34 sloped armor, powerful gun, reliable diesel engine, wide tracks became standard for tank design worldwide. During the Korean War, the North Korean Army used Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. Also, the T-34 was the primary armored unit for Eastern Bloc nations. It was used to suppress the East German uprising in 1953 and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Through these uses, the T-34 became a symbol for global Soviet power and, at times, repression. The irony wasn't lost on history. The tank that had liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi tyranny became, in turn, an instrument of oppression. Roman 18 in Russia, monuments to the T-34 are ubiquitous. But in Budapest and Prague, the memories are more complex. German veterans who survived the war carried the memory of the T-34 for the rest of their lives. At reunions, they would speak of many horrors: the Russian winter, the partisans, the artillery barrages. But when they spoke of the T-34, their voices would drop to a whisper. Hans Müller, a Panzer IV commander who fought from 1941 to 1945, told an interviewer in the 1990s, "We feared many things in Russia: the cold, the vastness, Stalin's organs, Katyusha rockets. But most of all, we feared the T-34. It was like fighting against the future with the past." The T-34 wasn't perfect. Far from it. Besides the poor state of older tanks, the new T-34s and KVs suffered from initial mechanical and design problems, particularly with regard to clutches and transmissions. Early models had terrible visibility. The two-man turret was cramped and inefficient. Quality control, especially in the desperate days of 1941 to 42, was often abysmal. From a tactical viewpoint, the T-34 was inferior to the German tank types PZIII and PZIV with long-barreled 75 mm gun, because it combined the functions of commander and gunner in one person. As soon as the commander began firing, he lost his overall viewpoint and was unable to direct his tank. Even as gunner, however, he was unable to fulfill his mission because when functioning as such, he had no commander from which to receive directions. But these flaws didn't matter when German shells bounced off its armor. They didn't matter when T-34s could traverse mud and snow that left German tanks stranded. They didn't matter when Soviet factories could produce them faster than the Germans could destroy them. The T-34 represented something beyond military technology. It embodied the Soviet Union's transformation from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse capable of defeating the most technically advanced military in the world. Every T-34 was a statement. We will not be conquered. The fact that it was there in so many thousands and thousands is a tribute to the diligence, to the devotion, to the patriotism, to the self-sacrifice not only of the soldiers, but of the population as a whole. It represents a triumph in enormous adversity, the kind of adversity that we have never even imagined. For the German soldiers who faced it, the T-34 was more than a tank. It was the physical manifestation of their worst nightmare. An enemy that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be stopped, and kept coming no matter how many you destroyed. It was the moment when the myth of German technological superiority died in the mud of the Eastern Front. The production statistics tell their own story of determination. Soviet tests on newly built T-34s showed that in April 1943, only 10.1% could complete a 330 km trial, and in June 43, this went down to 7.7%. The percentage stayed below 50% till October 1943, when it rose to 78%. In the next month, it dropped to 57%, and in the period December 43, January 44, the average was 82%. Even when quality was at its worst, they kept building. Even when workers were starving, they kept building. Even when German bombers struck the factories, they kept building. In Stalingrad, T-34s rolled off the production line and directly into combat, their paint still wet, crews learning to operate them on the way to the front. The German military's respect for the T-34 led to some remarkable situations. In the Panzerlich Armor Strength Report, from the beginning of 1945, a total of 89 T-34s were reported with the various tanks units. Most notably, one Ski-Edger division reported 28 T-34s, of which 9 were operational. German units were using captured T-34s because even their enemies' tanks were sometimes better than what they had. But maintaining captured T-34s proved nearly impossible. Mere possession of a captured tank is not enough. It is useless unless continuous maintenance of the vehicles is possible, and this depends on the availability of spare parts. Aside from technical difficulties, manufacture of spare parts for the T-34 in German factories would have been possible only at the expense of a reduction in the number of German tanks turned out. The T-34's legacy extended far beyond its technical specifications. It changed how wars were fought and won. It proved that superior technology alone couldn't guarantee victory. Numbers mattered. Production capacity mattered. The will to fight mattered. The Soviets were able to produce nearly 87,500 tanks of all kinds during the war, including some 64,550 T-34s, along with another 22,300 self-propelled guns and countless thousands of artillery pieces. From 1943 onward, the Soviets proved they had truly come into their own, having learned hard-fought lessons from the very best then in the world. By studying the enemy's tactics, They had gauged how to put their growing array of tanks, self-propelled guns, improved artillery, and even anti-aircraft weapons to good use. For German soldiers, facing T-34s became a test of nerves that many failed. Letters home spoke of the terror. "The Russian tanks are devils," wrote one soldier. "Our shells bounce off them like rain. Only when they are very close can we hope to penetrate their armor, but by then it is often too late." The tactical evolution forced by the T-34 was remarkable. Attempts to destroy the T-34s and KVs concentrated on first immobilizing them by firing at their tracks, and then by tackling them with field artillery, anti-aircraft guns, or by blowing them up at close range by shaped charge grenades. German soldiers learned to aim for tracks, vision slits, any vulnerable point. They learned to use their 88 anti-aircraft guns in a ground roll because it was one of the few weapons that could penetrate T-34 armor at range. Winter made everything worse for the Germans. Their precision machinery, designed for the good roads and mild climate of Western Europe, failed catastrophically in Russian conditions. Meanwhile, the T-34, designed for the harsh Soviet climate, thrived. The powerful engine, wide tracks, and Christie suspension allowed it to cross terrain other vehicles couldn't, giving the crews a greater chance of surviving the rush to close in on the Germans. The battle reports from German units facing T-34s make for grim reading. "Enemy tanks broke through our positions. Our 37 guns are useless. Request immediate support from 88 batteries, or we cannot hold." This message, repeated in various forms across the Eastern Front, tells the story of technological shock that the Wehrmacht never fully recovered from. By 1944, when the T-34-85 entered service, the psychological damage was complete. German soldiers knew that even their best tanks, the Panthers and Tigers that had been specifically designed to counter the T-34, were unreliable and too few in number. They knew that for every Panther that broke down, 10 T-34s would appear. The T-34's main strength was its cost and production time, meaning that German panzer forces would often fight against Soviet tank forces several times their own size. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about the industrial might of a nation fully committed to survival. The workers who built the T-34s became heroes in their own right. In Stalingrad, as German forces approached the factories, workers mounted guns on freshly built tanks and drove them straight into battle. Some hadn't even been properly tested. The factory militia, armed with rifles and fighting alongside their own creations, held the Germans long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The fear the T-34 inspired went beyond its battlefield performance. It represented the failure of Nazi ideology. The subhuman Slavs had created a tank superior to anything in the German arsenal. The Jewish Bolshevik system had outproduced the mighty German industry. Every T-34 that appeared on the battlefield was proof that the racial theories underlying the Nazi worldview were lies. Production of the T-34 went uninterrupted until the end of the European campaign in 1945, to which 57,000 T-34s were in circulation by that time. In fact, the T-34 replaced production of all other Soviet combat tank types during peak usage, with 42 factories participating. In 1940, only 97 T-34s were produced, with 3,000 following in 1941. From 97 tanks to 57,000, the production curve tells its own story of a nation's mobilization for total war. Each tank represented not just steel and machinery, but the labor of workers who often went hungry so that soldiers could fight. The ingenuity of engineers who simplified designs so that inexperienced workers could build them. The sacrifice of an entire people. Veterans of the Eastern Front, when asked years later what weapon they feared most, would often pause before answering. Some would mention the Katyusha rockets, others the seemingly endless Soviet artillery. But many, particularly tank crews, would simply say the T-34 and fall silent, lost in memories they preferred not to share. The T-34's influence on post-war tank design cannot be overstated. Every major tank-producing nation studied its features. The sloped armor became universal. The emphasis on mobility and reliability over complexity influenced designs from the American M48 pattern to the British Centurion. Even the Germans, in their post-war Leopard tanks, incorporated lessons learned from their bitter experience facing T-34s. The effectiveness of the T-34 was such that it remained a mainstay of the Soviet army for a decade after the war. But by the mid-1950s, it had been surpassed by its descendant, the T-54, and the Red Army began phasing it out in favor of that tank, with T-34s finally leaving Soviet service in the 1960s. It continued in service in other communist countries for decades afterward, a testament to the enduring quality of this most influential of tanks. For the German soldiers who survived to old age, the T-34 remained a spectre that haunted their memories. At veterans' reunions, they would speak of the Eastern Front with a mixture of pride in their survival and horror at what they had endured. But when the topic turned to Soviet tanks, specifically the T-34, voices would drop and heads would shake. "You cannot understand unless you were there," one veteran explained to his grandson. "We had been told we were the master race, that our technology was superior, that victory was certain. Then we met the T-34, and we learned what fear truly means. Not just fear of death, but fear that everything we had believed was wrong." The factories that produced the T-34 became symbols of Soviet industrial achievement. In the old production city of Nizhny Tagil, a particularly grand T-34 monument rests in a main square. There is little doubt that this tank is worth more to the people there than the $40,000 the old tank would fetch on the open market. These monuments stand not just as memorials to a machine, but to an entire generation that refused to surrender. They remind us that technology alone does not win wars, the human spirit does. The T-34 was good enough to fight and win, produced in numbers that overwhelmed quality with quantity, crewed by soldiers who knew that defeat meant the extinction of their people. The German fear of the T-34 was rational. It was the fear of facing an enemy that could not be deterred by superior training, could not be stopped by superior tactics, and could not be defeated by superior technology alone. It was the fear of facing the aroused fury of a people fighting for their very existence. As the war progressed, the T-34 evolved from a shocking surprise to an expected nightmare. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive profile, the sloped armor that their guns couldn't penetrate, the wide tracks that allowed it to appear from impossible directions. They learned the sound of its diesel engine, different from their own gasoline-powered vehicles. They learned to fear that sound. Reports from German units consistently mention the psychological impact. "The appearance of enemy T-34 tanks has caused panic among our troops," reads one report from 1941. By 1943, the tone had changed to weary acceptance. "Enemy attacking with approximately 50 T-34s will hold as long as possible." By 1945, there was only resignation. T-34s have broken through, retreating to secondary positions. The T-34 forced a complete re-evaluation of German military doctrine. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on combined arms tactics, where tanks, infantry, and air support worked in concert. But what good were tactics when your tanks couldn't penetrate enemy armor? What good was air support when factories beyond the Urals produced tanks faster than Stukas could destroy them? In addition, the Germans had an obsession with more and more unique models, while the Soviets relied mainly on the T-34. Thus, if one of their mobile units broke down, the Nazis might have difficulty in finding spare parts, while the tankers of the Red Army could literally scour any battlefield and find parts for their damaged T-34s. This simplicity was perhaps the T-34's greatest strength. While German tanks grew ever more complex, requiring specialized tools and highly trained mechanics, the T-34 could be maintained by its crew with basic tools. Parts from destroyed tanks could be salvaged and reused. Repairs that would require a workshop for German tanks could be performed in the field for T-34s. The human dimension of the T-34 story is often overlooked. Each tank required a crew of 4, later 5, in the T-34 to 85. These men lived, fought, and often died together in a steel box barely larger than a small car. They endured temperatures that ranged from in winter to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the tank during summer combat. Soviet tank crews developed their own culture, their own superstitions. They would paint slogans on their tanks, "For Stalin," "For the motherland," or simply the name of a fallen comrade. They learned that survival depended on aggression. Closing with German tanks negated their superior optics and long-range accuracy. Furthermore, many commanders were combat veterans, either from the tank corps or from other branches of the Red Army. They were generally quick-witted, observant, and fearless. Training for enlisted men, however, was of a far lower caliber. Many drivers had no more than a few hours' practice at the controls and had never had any instruction in tactical placement. Loaders were equally undertrained, often having had no more than a day's basic instruction in how to handle ammunition and operate the breech. Instruction for gun commanders was a little better, but they still lacked hands-on experience acquiring targets and firing at moving targets. Yet despite this minimal training, these crews achieved the impossible. They learned by doing, and those who survived became formidable opponents. By 1943, veteran T-34 crews had developed tactics that maximized their tanks' strengths and minimized weaknesses. The T-34 also changed the geography of battle. Its wide tracks and powerful engine allowed it to operate in terrain that German doctrine considered tank-proof. Marshes, deep snow, mud that would swallow a Panzer IV, the T-34 crossed them all. German units learned that there was no such thing as secure flanks when facing T-34s. This mobility advantage became crucial as the war progressed. During the great Soviet offensives of 1944 to 45, T-34s would appear behind German lines, having traversed impassable terrain. The psychological impact of finding enemy tanks where they couldn't possibly be further eroded German morale. The production story of the T-34 is one of the great industrial achievements of the 20th century. The factory relocation did little to hamper the massive increase of T-34 production to counter the German invasion. It is estimated that 1,800 T-34s were produced in 1940, 2,800 in 1941, and over 30,000 T-34s were produced between 1942 to 44. Manufacturing efficiencies enabled these production increases. Between 1941 and 1943, both the cost and time it took to create a T-34 were cut in half. Think about that. In the middle of the most devastating invasion in history, with major industrial centers under threat or occupied, the Soviet Union not only maintained tank production, but increased it dramatically while simultaneously making the process more efficient. The workers who achieved this miracle paid a terrible price. They worked shifts that would be illegal in peacetime, in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Many were teenagers or women who had never worked in heavy industry before. They learned on the job, driven by the knowledge that every tank they built might save their country. In the final analysis, the German fear of the T-34 was about more than just a tank. It was fear of what that tank represented, an enemy that refused to admit defeat, an industrial base that could not be destroyed, and a people willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The them he was referring to were the famed Soviet Red Army T-34 battle tanks that had come as such a nasty surprise to the Nazis in the summer of 1941, and then went on to become a major reason for the German army panzers being halted at the gates of Moscow. Matthew Hughes and Chris Mann, in their 2002 work The T-34 Russian Battle Tank noted, the presence of the T-34-76 in 1941 proved to be a rude shock for the Germans. Compared to other Soviet tanks, the T-34 was able to take on and destroy the best of the German panzers. The T-34 taught the world a lesson that military planners still study today. In war, good enough in massive numbers often beats perfect in small quantities. The German Tiger tank was superior to the T-34 in almost every technical specification, but there were never more than a few hundred Tigers operational at any time. There were tens of thousands of T-34s. For the German soldiers who faced them, each T-34 destroyed meant nothing. There would always be more. They kept coming through the snow and mud, their guns blazing, their crews fighting with desperate courage. They came from factories beyond the reach of German bombers, built by workers the Germans would never see, driven by men who preferred death to slavery. The last German veterans of the Eastern Front are now gone, but their memoirs and interviews preserve the memory of facing the T-34. Almost without exception, they speak of it with a combination of professional respect and lingering fear. It was the weapon that taught them they could be beaten, the machine that proved their ideology false, the tank that drove them from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. In the end, the T-34 was more than German soldiers feared. It was the sword that cut the heart out of the Nazi war machine. Every German soldier who faced it learned the same lesson. Superiority in courage and production could overcome superiority in technology and training. It was a lesson written in steel and paid for in blood, a lesson that echoes still in the thunderous legacy of the T-34. The story ends where it began, with fear, but not German fear. In the spring of 1945, as T-34 to 85s rumbled through the streets of Berlin, it was German civilians who watched from their windows with terror, knowing that the weapon their soldiers had feared for 4 years had finally come home. The T-34 had traveled from the factories of the Urals to the heart of the Third Reich, and with it came the judgment that German soldiers had dreaded since they first encountered it on that foggy morning in 1941. The T-34 remains the most produced tank model in history, a testament to its effectiveness and the industrial might that created it. But more than that, it remains a symbol of how determination, sacrifice, and the will to survive can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. For the German soldiers who feared it, the T-34 was death itself, rolling toward them on broad tracks through the mud and snow of Russia, unstoppable and unforgiving. They were right to fear it. In the end, their fears were prophecy, and the T-34 was its fulfillment.